muito bom dia aos colegas do Brasil, né, e aos colegas também dos Estados Unidos e de toda a América Latina que nos seguem. Bom dia, boa tarde, né, aos nossos irmãos angolanos. Eu falo aqui hoje em nome da professora Carla Ventura, nossa diretora do Instituto de Estudos Avançados da USP. Né? Eu tenho enorme satisfação de seguir, agora na condição de pesquisador, né, do Instituto, nessa muito importante rede climática, Climate Network, né, essa rede climática entre Brasil em Angola, e muito provavelmente se expandirá para toda a América Latina e em muitos outros também países irmãos africanos, né? Aqui conosco hoje eu tenho a honra de ladear a professora Ruth Estevão, que é também a presidente da Associação de Criminólogos de Língua Portuguesa, e a Berta Carrango, né, que representa aqui a Umbala do Saber e a Universidade Jean Piaget. Nosso convidado de hoje, o nosso convidado de hoje nos dá um privilégio imenso em poder participar conosco desses trabalhos aqui. Eu tenho absoluta convicção de que será apenas o primeiro, né, de uma série extremamente propositiva, de um diálogo construtivo entre esses três ecossistemas, a Amazônia, o complexo Mayombe, a bacia hidrográfica do Congo e o Sahel africano. Nessa região para nós tão desconhecida, que vai do Senegal, passando pela Mauritânia, Mali, Burkina Faso, Níger até o Chad. Né? É um ponto extremamente delicado do planeta, hoje também um dos pontos de não reversão, um dos pontos irreversíveis, um tipping point planetário, que está extremamente conectado à dinâmica climática de todo o planeta. Né? Abrir mão, né, de uma proteção, da preservação ambiental, da proteção da cobertura vegetal do Sahel africano, é abrir mão também da nossa próprio balanço climático. Né? A nossa indiferença moral histórica com relação ao Sahel não pode mais prosperar. Né? Essa é a lógica mais básica. Né? E o professor Leonardo Villalon, né, que é professor do Departamento de Political Science, né, de Ciência Política e dos estudos, é um grande africanista, né, dos African Studies, da Universidade da Flórida, e o coordenador do Sahel Research Group, né, da mesma universidade. Né? É um profundo conhecedor da matéria, o autor, né, o grande organizador, né, o grande editor do Oxford Handbook of the African Sahel, né, que foi a partir dali, inclusive, que nós chegamos ao conhecimento dele, num trabalho fascinante, que congrega insights extremamente originais, sobretudo a partir daquilo que nós enfatizamos desde o nosso primeiro encontro da rede climática, né? Que nós não somos apenas vítimas do planeta, né? Nós, nessa construção, nesse diálogo Brasil-Angola, nessa construção desses dois ecossistemas negligenciados pelo planeta, nós podemos representar também um blueprint, né? Um grande modelo de superação e resiliência climática em todo o planeta. Né? Aí agora a gente faz o switch para o inglês, né? E eu queria lhes dizer, mais uma vez, né, que falar mal inglês não é um problema. O importante é falar, né? O importante é se expressar e se comunicar. Né? Ter o broken English como o meu, né, é algo que é extremamente recomendável. Né? E é importante para nós, se a gente quer ter voz planetária, a gente encontrar um idioma que possa ser também uma gramática universal. Professor Villalon, it's a tremendous privilege to have you here. So thanks a lot. I hope that we can have today only the first of a very constructive and productive collaboration. Yeah. Before I give you the floor, I just want to open the floor for Berta. Berta, por favor, could you please use the floor is yours, Berta. Oh, we have also Patrício Jeremias representing the Umbala do Saber, yeah? Patrício, você quer fazer uso da palavra também, meu caro? Não te ouvimos, meu caro. Patrício. Berta? Não, a gente não te ouve, perdão.
Opa, e agora?
Por favor, agora sim.
Agora?
Já.
Tá, não, vamos começar, não tem problema nenhum. Eu estou atrasado e peço as minhas desculpas, mas podemos começar.
Perfeito. Berta, você gostaria de fazer uso da palavra, Berta? Bom, como a Berta está tendo ali os seus problemas, Professor Villalon, in the name of the University of São Paulo, University Jean Piaget, Umbala do Saber e Amazônia Research Center, I want to truly thank you. So warm thanks for your time and to share your tremendous experience of research with us. Please, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Obrigado, Eduardo and colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here. I had a brief discussion, I can say, the other day with Eduardo and with Professor Mosquito in Angola, and it was very intriguing to me, the idea of this comparison. And so I'm very happy to do this, and I hope it can be the beginning of a discussion, as Eduardo said earlier. I excuse myself that I'll speak in English. Maybe next time I can manage it in Portuguese. Spanish or French would be possible, but English is probably better. Yes, as Eduardo said, I coordinate the Sahel Research Group at the University of Florida, which is an interdisciplinary laboratory, social science laboratory, focused on the countries of the West African or the Francophone Sahel, and very involving colleagues from a variety of disciplines as well as graduate students, etc. And we have a variety of different projects. And in recent years, in the last few years, with several colleagues, my main project has been one effectively on climate change in the Sahel. And so what I propose to do today, and I'm going to switch to a presentation so that I can show you a lot of images and some of what we've done. I propose today is to give you an overview of this current research project. I have to say, I prepared it. It's an overview that I had prepared for other audiences to present the project in general. I'm happy to, I'll present it to you, and then I'm happy to take questions on other aspects as parts of it. It's sort of sweeping because I'm attempting to cover the description of the entire project, but more than happy. I'm especially interested because I confess I know very little about Amazonia or about Mayombe. I think those are, as Eduardo said, both very different areas, and yet perhaps some interesting parallels can be drawn between those resource-rich areas and the relatively resource-poor Sahel. And so I hope you can help me find some of the connections between these various regions, and I look forward to a discussion now and in the future. Let me then thank you with just a little bit of introduction, if I can do this. And ask there.
It's perfect. Yeah, it's
can
perfect.
You see me there? Okay. Thank you so much then. Okay. So yeah, as I said, I will run through this. I can hear you, so please stop me if I'm going too quickly or if I need to move on or if there are any issues. So I just hide that. Uh-oh. Can you? No.
Not yet. Yes. Now it's
okay.
Now it's perfect. Yes.
Now it's perfect. Okay.
Please go on.
Sorry about that. I think I've got it now. Okay. Thank you so much. So, as I said, this is a project that we've been working on for about 3 years. You see there the title of the project, Social and Institutional Determinants of Vulnerability and Resilience to Climate Hazards in the Sahel. And I want to point out that it's a project that I have led along with 2 colleagues here, Professor Renata Serra and Professor Sarah McCune, and as well as some graduate students, other colleagues, and until very recently, our colleague Steve Rattle, who is a professor at the United States Air Force Academy, and whom I don't mind mentioning, resigned recently in protest at the Trump administration's policies. So he's now an independent scholar. And the point of the project, I think, is that this is very much a social science project, attempting to understand the social structures and the institutions that are affecting the way people understand and respond to climate hazards in the Sahel, with the idea of questioning how the impact of those institutions and those social structures shape either resilience or vulnerability. And of course, the region is frequently described as a highly vulnerable, highly fragile region, which it is, I think, but we made a special effort to try to find sources of resilience in the area. I think you'll see that there are sources of resilience, but they're also true that those sources of resilience are under the historical sources of resilience are under extraordinary pressure at the moment. And so it's a complex and difficult situation in the Sahel at the moment. Just to give a very, very brief presentation for any of you who may not be familiar with the Sahel, very important to note that those 6 countries that we're focused on, I'm sorry, the map, you can see them there, right, from Senegal to Chad. Those 6 countries are among, by most international statistics, among the least developed countries on Earth, particularly the 4 landlocked countries, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali. You can see that over the years for the UNDP HDI, or Human Development Index, they're frequently at the very bottom, in the bottom 5, bottom 6 or 8 of countries in the world. Senegal and Mauritania are a little bit higher. They have a coastline, they have fish protein and some other advantages, but they're nevertheless, these are all countries at the very low end of the human development scale. There are also countries, and these are the 4 countries in which we work that I'll be presenting in a minute, but they're all very similar with a very striking population demographics, with very, very youthful populations. So you can see Niger on one end, the median age is below 15. This is, of course, has huge implications for the future of this area in terms of population growth. You see those population pyramids are really, really quite striking. And then the region, this is all just to give you a context, is a region that unfortunately, although historically it was relatively underdeveloped, and poor, nevertheless, a peaceful area up until 12 or 15 years ago. But since 2012, the whole region has been characterized by political instability, the proliferation of jihadist armed groups. As Eduardo just asked questions about how to label these, but they're insurgencies, they're rebellions, they're motivated in part and affiliated with various international Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or others. This has accelerated in the last 5 years. There have been 6 coups in 4 of the countries, 2 each in Mali and Burkina Faso, as well as in Chad and Niger. There's been a very strong flip from in 2012 when the French were welcomed in Mali to help stop this jihadi insurgency that threatened to overthrow the government. There's been a rise now of very strong anti-French and by extension anti-Western American and European sentiments in the area. And the regional organizations that historically helped manage this region of a number of small and relatively underdeveloped countries are very much under fire, and especially ECOWAS, or CEDEAO, which is the Economic Community of West African States. 3 of the countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have withdrawn from ECOWAS and declared their own alliance called the Alliance des États du Sahel, so the Alliance of Sahelian States. And have realigned their foreign policies. And so we have an area with increased international competition. I'm in the United States. In the United States, it's huge anxiety about the presence of Russia with the Wagner Group and other Russian, and now the Africa Corps, which has succeeded it, but also Chinese, Turks, the Turkish presence, Iranian, and others in the region. So it has become an area of significant international competition, usually, I think, with negative consequences for the local population. So that gives us just a very, very brief sense of the sort of the demographic, economic, and political context of the region. And within this area, what we set out to do was to sort of, the questions were about what are the sources, what are the kinds of behaviors and choices that people make that shape the relative degree of resilience or vulnerability to a very changing and difficult climate situation. And so we wanted to know, how do people understand climate change? What do people understand about ways to adapt, their sources of resilience or vulnerability? What are the kinds of roles of institutions, both formal and informal ones, in shaping how people respond? And how are these institutions connected within the system, both connecting actors and connected to each other and affecting the capacity of response? So these are very broad questions, obviously, that we wanted to ask, but the idea was exactly to get this interdisciplinary team to look very much empirically on the ground in a number of sites. What we attempted to do, what we actually did, was to identify, we worked in 4 of the 6 countries. Unfortunately, we didn't have the resources to work in all 6, but in addition, both Mali and Burkina Faso the security situation is so bad that it became impossible to do local level fieldwork outside of the areas, not only for my team as foreigners, but even for our local colleagues. It's no longer possible to do this kind of research in small areas. So in the other 4 countries, which allowed us to take 2 on the western edge of the Sahel, Senegal and Mauritania, and 2 on the eastern side, Niger and Chad, we chose local level sites with the idea of taking small urban centers far from the capital city, which have a state presence, but where livelihoods, where people's lives are mostly tied to the rural sector, that is to agriculture or pastoralism or related kinds of activities. And so the idea was to do intensive field work we chose 5 sites, 2 in Senegal and 1 in each of the other countries, and small urban centers, and then to work collaboratively with local institutions, with local colleagues, to do intensive fieldwork in those areas, as well as in the capital city, to see what national level policies and institutions and how they articulated to the local level. I'll tell you a little bit more about the various instruments we used there to attempt to get at these questions. Just a few words then about climate change in the Sahel per se. First, the Sahelian climate by definition is defined by it's a semi-arid zone about rainfall. The typical definitions define the area as an area where you have between 200 and 600 millimeters per year of rainfall, those isohets, those lines of areas. And you can see this map that shows changes from the 1940s to then to the 2000s. You can see in 2 periods, average rainfall isohets have moved significantly south. That means that areas have become increasingly more arid to the north and as it's moved south. And so this is the sort of the longer term issues of climate change. The Sahelian climate is characterized by a short rainy season, typically of about 3 months, starting, depending in the east, starting about now in Chad or Niger in June, maybe in July further west, and running for about 3 months, where virtually all of the annual rainfall falls during that period. It's followed by a period where there can be some agriculture based on collected rainwater and rain runoff, and then followed by a bit of a cooler season before entering where some of the agriculture and pastoralism still works with the grasses that were grown during the rainy season, and then by a very hot season in typically February, March, April, May, depending exactly on the site, so extreme heats. Now, what's happened before the rains start again in June or July? What is happening in the recent years in the region is that we see the changes in those patterns. First of all, increased variability. The rains are coming late or starting early. They're becoming at different times, and they're becoming less predictable in terms of the pattern of rainfall. They're also coming, sometimes you have an extended period of the rain stopping, of pauses in the rain during the rainy season, followed by massive rains with causing flooding and inundation. So paradoxically, in a very arid area, flooding has become a huge problem in the area. And then both heat and the consequences of heat in the dry season, especially dust storms and the related issues that brings, are also, we've seen last year was on record as some of the very hottest years in the region. And so extreme heat to the point of making things extraordinarily difficult on all counts. So there's sort of the climate of the big overview of climate change in the region. Now our field sites, here they are, you can see them. There's that green band is the rainfall isohets roughly, and so that is actually the rainfall. You see that our 5 sites are located directly within it. One Kaffrine in Senegal is a little bit further to the south, and in fact that's a bit different. The others are on the northern end of that. That is, they are quite arid zones, very much marked by these Sahelian patterns. In each of these countries, we worked with institutional partners. I have to say, from our perspective at the Sahel Research Group, it's always extremely important to work and collaborate with local colleagues. And one of the pleasures I had discussing the other day was to see your collaborations between Brazilian and Angolan institutions. And so these are the institutional partners I'm happy to talk about. And within those institutions, we have researchers who are affiliated with each of those institutions. You can see a very interdisciplinary team, anthropologists, socioeconomists, geographers, health specialists, etc., in the region. And so we comprise the whole team, including our team here and the others from the region. And have worked collaboratively. Now, I'm going quickly just to be able to give you a presentation and to get to some of the substance. The fieldwork over the course of last year, that is 2024, starting in January, that entire team you just saw met in Dakar for a week of preparation, and then we branched out across the region. And the idea was to conduct research at various points around the calendar year so that we were able to be at each of the sites during the hot, dry season, during the beginning of the rains, during the later rains and the harvest, and then the post-rainy season. And so attempted to sort of, follow the whole annual season there. We did a number of methods, surveys in each site, but also especially intensive qualitative interviewing of households and of mid-level people, which have all been transcribed and translated and transcribed, etc. It's a fairly long effort. Just to give you a sense of the importance of doing it over the course of the annual cycle, here's the site in Malem Odar, which is Kaffrine in Senegal, the one I mentioned a minute ago. Outside, you see on the top left a photograph of a women's group. It's a women's cooperative that had an agricultural product. And in February, that is towards the end of the relatively cooler season, with irrigation, you see a field of tomatoes doing extremely well. Their tomatoes are well, and they were very proud of it. Last year, the heats were extraordinary. And in addition, in this region, they had an infestation of these, they call pilgrim crickets, criquet pèlerin, these crickets here. And so you can see just 3 months later on the bottom right, when I visited this area, that was the fields. They had been devastated completely. And so these are the kinds of climatic and natural challenges that this region faces. And hence the importance of seeing it across different points of the year, right? Those are very different pictures. We mentioned the interviews, the meso level, what we call the meso level. The point was to interview local state officials, local authorities, the delegates and representatives of various ministries, agriculture, livestock, water, health, environment, eau et forêt, which is the forest services, etc., as well as representatives of NGOs, development agencies, both international organizations and local organizations and regional ones, as well as local development NGOs. So we're looking at institutional actors, informal institutional actors as well, informal in the sense of traditional, so local associations, canton or traditional chiefs. There's associations of pastoralists, self-help associations, women's groups, women's associations, etc., traditional authorities. And then we did group-level interviews with communities, with market authorities, with groups that have settled pastoralists, of agriculturalists, of other, and did basically focus group, large group discussions with such communities. We did household level interviews intensively in each site to try to go in depth in any given household in terms of their experience of climate hazards, household responses, vulnerabilities, who was responsible in a household for certain activities, what income generating resources are available when agriculture or other issues fail, etc. And then we did a more quantitative survey in each of them, approximately 100, some variation given the conditions of the sites, but using some standard instruments to measure things like food security, food insecurity, and vulnerability, etc. We had a couple of other innovative methods as well. This is one of our PhD students, a Colombian student named Costa, who did a method called photo voice. He asked people to take photographs and discuss issues. We also did with my colleagues something they developed called community concept drawing, where communities actually produce these mental maps of areas. I'm going very quickly through this, but to give you a sense of the sort of variety of methodologies we used. Since I'm speaking into a screen and I can't see anyone, I want to ask, is everyone following okay? And am I going, is it okay? So
No,
far?
it's perfect. It's
Okay.
perfect. Of course, that I would love to hear you much more on each single slide, but please.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I'm going very quickly. I hope
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is
but
the
it's
beginning of
amazing.
much longer conversations. Okay.
Please,
I wanna
go
know.
ahead.
Let me then tell you this. I spent a little too much time on presenting the Sahel and the project. But let me tell you then about some of the substantive areas that we are now beginning the process of sort of analysis and trying to understand in some of the domains. And so you can see we're an interdisciplinary team. So we're very concerned food security and insecurity, which is huge. Health issues are very large in the area, both direct and indirect consequences of climate change. Household economics and livelihoods. Pastoralism is a hugely important in the Sahel. That is, pastoralist movement of people, mostly nomadic or semi-nomadic populations with their animals and under extreme pressure. Water management, of course, in this area, including flood. The question of migration and movement comes up, and I think that's a pretty universal one. I'll mention a little bit. In the more explicitly political side, the questions of governance, of state capacity, of the coordination of governance across levels, and then the complicating factors of conflict and political violence in the region and how these are affecting. So these are all very broad areas that we're attempting to understand, to use all that data to understand. The question, what I'd like to do is make some comments then about the governance, some of the aspects. And again, I'll have to go quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions now or later about some of these. Governing the climate change, this slide, this billboard you see just gives an example. You can see it's FAO on the one hand, on the upper left, international organizations. It's got the government of Senegal on the bottom right. It's got an NGO, a European NGO, and then you see it's the Commune de Thiel, that is, it's a local commune. We have this multiple scale, multiple levels, efforts at interaction, from international organizations to local level communes to NGOs, all intervening there. In this context of this very thing, what are some of the things that we're beginning to sort of begin to analyze and understand that are happening in the area? So, first of all, across this region, despite similarities, there's also a lot of variation in state capacity. And in what my colleague Greg Mann, who is a historian of the Sahel at Columbia University, calls non-governmentality, which was his word for the development from the 1970s and the drought of the early 1970s of a regime where states largely relinquished a lot of governance capacity to non-governmental institutions, hence the term non-governmentality, or NGOs. And so we had governance by NGOs. That's, in many ways, I think, still extremely relevant in the area as a conception. Local state institutions vary enormously in their capacity, in their funding, and in their human resources. In each of our sites, again, we're looking far from the capital city and small urban centers. The extent to which there is a functional, actual state presence in each area is a lot of variation, and the extent to which this density of NGOs and other local actors sort of pick up. So we have this wide variation in terms of actually the capacity there. Just to give you some examples and some of the things we see, I won't be able to go into these examples in depth, but we see some areas where the state, and in particular in a place like Chad at the extreme east, a particularly weak state, and where we see state predation as the state actually preys on local populations, so that the example that's alluded to there is where local state officials took advantage of what was supposed to be the aid distribution to, in fact, extract resources from the local population. That's at one end of the spectrum. You see this, the hotspot concentration, another phenomenon in aid deserts, even within Chad, in the town in which we were working, which is called Masakori. It's not far from the Lake Chad Basin. The Lake Chad Basin, for reasons of a lot of interest in terms of the climatic changes of that area, but also because of the presence of Boko Haram, that you may have heard of, this rebel insurgent group, jihadi group, in the area, has attracted enormous attention. As a result, there's a huge concentration of NGOs working in the Lake Chad Basin and none working in other areas not so far away. And so we have this aid desert and the constant complaint about that fact. In Mauritania, another example is a sort of state bias. When we have states inequality in Mauritania, which has long been characterized by a stratified social structure and a lot of tension between the Arabic-speaking or Moorish population, and within that between the people of higher status and the people of historically slave status who are lower, as well as the Black African population of Mauritania. We see this sort of state bias play out. And so in our field site in 2 different communities, we see very different kinds of state responses. So these are some examples of the kinds of how politics and state capacity affects the area. We also have just simply in terms of the state's capacity to ensure oversight or coordination. And again, I apologize, I'm going very quickly, but I want to give you a feel for some of these issues. Let me just mention in Zinder in Niger, speaking to the ministry, the local representatives of hydrology, of the Ministry of Hydrology, their great complaint is this is an area that has attracted a lot of NGO attention, and the NGOs come, but the state has very little capacity to actually regulate or supervise or to oversee the activities of those NGOs. The representative there told us, I can't even go to visit these sites unless they offer to take me in their vehicles because I don't have vehicles or I don't have petrol to take the vehicle. So the point is sort of the relative balance of state capacity versus NGO capacity varies enormously. We also have this phenomenon of donor-driven priorities, especially large-scale infrastructure projects. So there's an example in Senegal of a hugely expensive project that has been funded largely by the Islamic Development Bank with a huge amount of money, but over which the state has relatively little control, and it's not clear that it would be a priority in terms of the use of those funds, but this is an outside donor-driven sort of priority. And so in this context of weak state capacity, we have that kind of thing. We also have the phenomenon of the very wide diversity of providers of crucial things like water access. And so here, just as an example on this slide, you see in the bottom left, this is a local village where the village is providing its own water with a hand-dug well and horse traction and children pulling up the water. It's quite deep and a well there. On the bottom right, you see a water pump, which is donated by the local telephone company, Airtel. And you can see this well is a gift of Airtel Chad, etc. So it's sort of a local business organization. And at the top, an international agent, an NGO of some sort, which says USA. Has a Korean flag. I believe it's a Korean American church. You can see it's got a religious slogan there. And so my point is that we have a very wide diversity of actors of very different scales and very different capabilities providing water. That's water for humans. Also, there's a lot to be said. Water access for animals in the pastoralist regions, extremely important. So on the right, you have an official state watering point in Senegal. On the left is sort of an unofficial one in Chad, where a water tower intended for other purposes has been diverted to allow pastoralists to water their camels there. The question of providing urban water, I won't go into it in depth because I'm afraid I won't have time, but we're doing a case study of the town in Massakori, Chad, where there was a huge investment. The water issues are extremely difficult because the water table has dropped. And so the town frequently has no water. There was an effort between 2015 and 20 or 16 and 20 for a European Union project to build a deep well, 35 kilometers of well and a tower. Local contractors built it. Unfortunately, the tower was defective, and when it was first filled, it collapsed. And so the provision of water is very much tied into the politics now and the disagreements about whose responsibility it is to attempt to repair these issues. The Europeans are refusing to invest more money if there's not local responsibility. In the meantime, the pumping is very limited and the town has frequent water shortages. So yeah, a difficult political context. Switching gears completely, that's a sort of an overview of some of the many topics related to state capacity and NGOs and the provision of services. How do people adapt, and what are people trying to adapt? All across the region, as I'm sure you have seen in the news and elsewhere, migration is probably the top adaptive strategy. Young men in particular leave, and many households depend on the remittances from those young men. to survive under the current circumstances as things get difficult. Some migration is seasonal. People will move to, historically in Mali or Burkina Faso, even Niger, people would move down to the coastal countries in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire during the agricultural season to harvest and then come back. But increasingly, of course, it's long-term and far more distant. And so we now have increasingly the international phenomenon of both people leaving from along the West African coast, attempting to reach primarily the Canary Islands on small boats like the one you see there being pulled ashore in Mauritania, these pirogues, as they call them, to try to reach the Canary Islands, which is, of course, part of Spain, so they're in Europe, or conversely to trust the trans-Saharan route passing through northern Niger and into Algeria or Libya, both extremely high risk and both with a lot of international efforts to stop them. So it's there's a very, very crucial issue there. This is the politics of migration management have meant that a lot of the outside efforts officially to deal with climate change or in fact have this dual priority and the confluence of these dual priorities of attempting both to find climate change adaptation and to mitigate migration confounds and complicates, obviously, these projects. So you hear, this is just an example of a project in Niger, Projet de stabilisation de renforcement. You can read it, I'm sure, in the French, stabilization and reinforcement, socioeconomic in the regions of Agadez. It's a European Union project, and you can see in the part highlighted, the project is particularly focused on trying to support communities that are dependent on irregular migration to develop alternative socioeconomic activities. Their idea is that if you can create economic opportunities, a young man will not leave. My personal opinion is that these are small band-aids on very large problems and not likely to have much of an effect, but you can imagine how this affects the efforts, the politics of these kinds of efforts, the intersection of two goals, right? Climate change mitigation and migration management. There's all of these questions raise a lot of issues about the question of scale. I already alluded to it earlier. On the right is the project, on the bottom, these very large scale projects being funded from outside. And on the other hand, the community of Linguère in northern Senegal has a very, very local, small scale. The commune has made very small scale land where people can, with a well, where people can water. And there's some indications that those things, of course, work much better at the very local level. And so there's a question of what are the most effective scales to work out? What is possible? And it raises lots of questions. We could go on, but I won't have much time. The coordination, to continue that a bit across scales. Also, we have these very large transnational projects, regional projects, and then very local ones. And just to mention some of the more important ones in the region, the one you may have heard about is the Great Green Wall, which is a large transnational project, La Grande Muraille Verte in French, and you can see on the bottom left there sort of a very schematic map tracing out. It's supposed to run all the way across to Djibouti and to the Horn of Africa. Each of the countries in which we work have a national agency of the Great Green Wall, which is supposed to coordinate with the international agency, the Pan-African Agency of the Great Green Wall. That's on the bottom right there. Its headquarters are in Mauritania. You can see all the country flags relevant. That coordination, of course, is a challenge. And in fact, the Great Green Wall project has drawn a lot of criticisms for attracting huge amounts of funding because it sounds, it's very sexy, if you will, sort of appealing to invest money and build a wall of trees across Africa. In fact, in its implementation, it's been quite limited, but it remains. And so at any given national context, each country has adapted it to some other context in other ways. We have some regional ones that are a bit more useful. At the top right, you see something. PRAPS is the Projet Régional d'Appui au Pastoralisme, so du Sahel, the regional project for supporting pastoralism in the Sahel. And this is a World Bank-funded project, but very much focused on this region, which has attempted to harmonize policies with somewhat more success in this area, I think. This builds on CILS, C-I-L-S-S. You can see it on the text there. On the left is the Interstate Committee, Comité Interarctique de lutte contre la sécheresse au Sahel. So the Interstate Committee for struggle or to fight against drought in the Sahel. an organization founded with the great droughts of the 1970s, of the early 1970s in the region. So we have these sort of huge international projects, regional organizations, and then much more local ones. And so here, a variety of regional projects, local ones in each country. Trying to work at all these scales and across these political contexts, of course, creates lots of problems and a lot of constraints. In the region, unfortunately, despite the efforts of ECOWAS, which was intended originally as an effort to, the Economic Community of West African States was intended to create, facilitate regional trade. In fact, border closures and tensions have affected livestock movement enormously. Insecurity with the rise of jihadism means that mobility of pastoralists is extremely limited and difficult. Currency exchange rates are uncertain. The recent withdrawal of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger from ECOWAS and to create the Alliance of Sahelian States has added another dimension. And so in a place like Chad or Niger, a lot of the livestock is in fact exported, for example, to Nigeria. The Nigerian currency's fluctuations have been extremely challenging for people to be able to manage. We have national policies right now. This coming week is the major Muslim holiday called Tabaski in the region, or the Eid al-Adha, the Feast of the Sacrifice, where people families try to sacrifice a ram, a sheep for the holiday. And it's a hugely important event in all of this region. And families spend significant portions of their income on purchasing of that ram. The Niger, the Nigerian government, in an attempt to manage the price of rams, because there's huge protest when the price goes too high, has forbidden the exportation of sheep, primarily to Nigeria, so that there are more sheep available locally, and therefore the prices will be down. It's raised enormous complications. For one thing, it's not possible to police that completely with that thousands of kilometers of border people in fact cross. But more importantly, it's created all sorts of political dynamics. So you can see this sort of question of cross-regional coordination is extremely challenging. That's especially true with pastoralism and with movements of people. So you see a series of things. I won't be able to go into, I'm conscious of the time now, but just a word or two, as I've said it already, pastoralism is extremely important. All of these countries depend on pastoralism, and pastoralism by definition depends on mobility. Animals and people have to be able to move, or people have to be able to move with their animals to areas where there's pasture and then away, and to synchronize that with agriculture so that there's a constant issue, and you may have heard about tensions between agriculturalists and pastoralists. Historically, those have been managed in a variety of ways. With climate change, that's complicating it because there is animals are having to move more quickly because the grasses run out in certain areas, or it's changing the patterns, and those changing patterns of transhumance or movement of people and animals is creating potential for more conflict. As you also have the phenomenon where historically you had relatively small herds for households being moved. We have more and more very large herds of animals owned by rich people in capital cities, and who they hire people to manage for them. And so you get very different dynamics of these prestige herds held by relatively rich people. A lot of questions about social dynamics and the religious authorities in Senegal I won't have time to go into, but something of particular interest to me, where religious authorities have historically recruited labor for work in agricultural and especially the production of peanuts. And land was sort of cleared for that purpose, and that's of course used up pastoral land, and there's been efforts as a result of conflict. Again, I'm refuting to it very briefly. I wanted to say just a word about what I said has become also paradoxically in this region in the last few years, and last year was a huge record. Urban flooding of all sorts, but especially, of course, impacting populations in major urban areas has become a huge issue because of their changing rainfall patterns, where you have diluvial rains in short periods and then periods of drought. And it become highly politicized in the area, in urban areas. You can see some There's a road that's been blocked because sometimes roads become impassable. Here's some urban areas on the right. In Chad in particular, you can see in last year, it was a record year with extraordinary flooding in the capital city and in N'Djamena and in other areas with huge, you can see there were tens of thousands of people affected in the capital city, lots of deaths, cropland submerged, animals, huge cost of animals, etc. And you can see the headline there from Le Monde newspaper about it became a hugely political issue for the Chadian government, and it was forbidden to talk about it in political terms, to talk about the flooding because of the high sensitivity of it. This is just to give I have a student, a PhD student, writing a dissertation, a PhD thesis about this flooding and the politics of flood management. So these are some slides you can see from the river. This is on the left, in N'Djamena, the capital city, and which is on the confluence of the Shadi and the Logon rivers. You can see in the very center of that settled urban areas. And then you can see on the right last year, all those areas dramatically flooded between the two rivers. So a huge flooding phenomenon. So I wanted to mention that as a new phenomenon of climate change requiring different kinds of interventions. I've gone very, very quickly to try to give you a sense of what this project is about and some of the issues specifically on the governance side, which I am looking at more. My colleagues have focused a lot of attention on the health side. My colleague, Sarah McCune, is a public health specialist who's long experience in the region. She's interested in the nutritional impact, infectious diseases, non-infectious diseases, issues of respiratory and eye issues having to do with dust and heat, etc. So that's another dimension of the project. We also have my colleague Renata Serra, Dr. Serra, who is an economist, a development economist, looking very much at the questions of adaptations of household economies and household livelihoods and economic adaptations and local level organizations, etc. So that is to say that we have other dimensions of the project. Within it all, I think we're left with a lot of questions. As I said, we started with this idea of looking for the sources of resilience. How do people manage to adapt and survive under these changing and difficult circumstances? Historically, resilience in the Sahel was linked to mobility. You had to be able to move. That's becoming increasingly difficult for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And so people are having to find other ways. And we even ask ourselves, what do you mean by this? There are clearly short-term survival strategies in any given year. You can, for example, sell animals to meet the household needs for food. But that in the longer run, of course, that has other implications for the next year. And so we're sort of seeing the trade-off between short-term survival strategies and adaptation for the longer term. And of course, the whole question of the sustainability of any kinds of adaptations. What kinds of livelihoods would be sustainable? And by sustainable, do we mean that people are simply capable of surviving, or does it allow for sustainability that builds the basis for some kind of development, some kind of improvement of people's lives in what is, after all, one of the more challenging places on Earth, I think, for human livelihoods. So thank you very much. I apologize if I've gone very fast and covered a lot of ground, but I hope it's been of some interest. And voila, thank you there for your attention. You can find me very easily, look me up. There's my colleagues' emails as well. Happy to exchange with you folks as necessary. No, thank you. I'm going to, okay. Yeah, I'm going to see if I stopped presenting, stop. Yeah. Can we now see each other?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I hope you can see me now. I think you couldn't see me before, right, with the slide?
Yes. But now we can see you.
Okay.
Let me tell you something. I think it's really impressive, your work. I want to show all our respect for your work and your team, your group of research. It's so impressive. Congratulations for your work, and warm thanks for sharing your research experience with us.
Thank you.
And what is truly inspiring, from at least from my perspective here, is the fact that we've been claiming the space of the social sciences in the planetary debate, right? they are neglected. And then you came up with such a tremendous strategy of research. It's really inspiring in that sense. And then you began by using a social construct, which is the idea of vulnerability, right? Which in our discussions here, highly, let me say, monopolized, yeah, for the hard sciences, yeah. It's a very important piece that we are definitely not, we are definitely neglecting, yeah. I have literally 1,000 questions here, and I will, Patricio and Beth, I will use that privilege to begin here with it. As Professor Villalon knows, we want to use this meeting as a workshop as well, so that we can come up with the possibility of making a comparative work on the free ecosystems. I will let the Mayombe Congo Basin part to my colleagues here. Um, but it's definitely something that I would love to hear my Angolan colleagues about the growing violence in the region, and especially the migration that is coming to the region, but also the other way. Yeah. So how we can use the resources from the Mayombe Congo Basin area to create some shared responses. Yeah, for climate resilience in the continent, in the entire continent. Yeah. But coming turning back to Brazil again, I started, Professor Villalon, making notes on the similarities, and then I stopped it because I need to copy all your slides because it's everything so similar, unbelievably similar. Yeah, but I want to discuss some points here. Yeah.
Okay.
Even in the politics of flood, yeah, we are experiencing that right now in Brazil, not only in the south of Brazil, but also in northeastern of the country, where the floods that are concentrated in the south are creating a climate dynamic in the north, in the northeast eastern of the country, that are causing extreme droughts there. And then we will be having a desert in the middle of Brazil, yeah, in the state of Bahia. Yeah, the Institute of National Space Research already mapped it all. Yeah, very unfortunately, the politics of flood, they are here intertwined with the politics of extreme drought as well. Yeah. um, uh, Related to religious trends. Yeah. Um, as you know, as we've been discussing before, I'm trying to work on the idea of deforestation in the name of God, right? uh, that we are unfortunately experiencing in the Brazilian Amazon. Yeah, I want to hear you a little bit about the role of the jihadism in environmental degradation. Yeah, how are they responsible, acting, or even with omissions somehow in environmental degradation? So, what are their roles? Yeah, in that sense, can we see um, some similarities here as well? Because whenever we look at law enforcement in the Amazon, as we've been discussing, especially when they come from international institutions or actors, they are highly obsessed with drugs trafficking. They normally have nothing to do with deforestation, with timber trafficking. And then my question here, I want you to understand a little bit the dynamics, jihadism and the environmental degradations, to understand if the law enforcement in the area is obsessed as well in fighting terrorism or things like this, or all those umbrella concepts, but if they are having some outcomes, positive outcomes related to environmental protection as well. Yeah. So this is a question that I think that we can discuss now. You mentioned that our colleagues doing work on public health. Maybe we could have another workshop specifically with them, because in the projects at Manaus, our main focus is in the power of public health indicators. I took here notes related on that as well. Oh, I have a curiosity related to your project, because our project was only possible because we had the institutional support of the Public Defender's Office of the state of Amazonas, right? because the local communities, they don't fear, any threat. They actually, the public defender's office gave us legitimacy and trust from the local communities. You mentioned, it was very fast because of the time, right? But you mentioned some institutions that offered you support, right? I want to hear a little bit more about that. If the local communities, they support your work, or at the beginning they are a little bit distant, they resistant, including to collaborate, right? So how is that research experience as well?
Mhm.
Well, I have thousands of questions related to displacement, diversification, recidivism, but here, yeah, that's another thing that I want to hear. You use the community concept drawing strategy, right? CCD, right?
Mhm.
And I want to know if you think it's promising um, to enhance the quality of the social networks there, the social cohesion there.
Mhm.
If that views impacts in micro scale, or if it has scalability, right?
Mhm.
If those community uh, concept drawings, if we can make a broader use of it, if there is a potential for a
Mhm.
more a greater scale, to be replicated in a greater
Mhm.
um, scale. Well, I have another 1,000 questions, but so sorry. I'm definitely very inspired by your work. So I will remain with those questions here just to break the ice. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for all those reactions and questions. Would you like me to sort of comment on some, to respond?
Yes, please,
Can I do that
please.
now? Okay. Well, you raise a lot of issues. Let me just selectively
Yes,
sort of
yes, yes, please.
respond to some things. Yeah, the flooding, I think, is hugely interesting and important. I think probably there'd be comparisons, but maybe we'll think about in what we're finding, of course, is this is it's very much a political issue in terms of urban planning, settlement patterns, displacements of populations from areas that are developing, and therefore they're placed into floodplains, et cetera. And so I'm very interested in sort of the political patterns that create the conditions under which populations are affected by flooding. Why are people settling in floodplains, and why are they building in those areas? So there's much more, but I won't go into that a lot. Your very interesting question interests me a lot about religion. In fact, historically, a lot of my work in the Sahel started with questions of religion and politics. And this question of deforestation in the name of God, I like that terminology because I can tell you it resonates in some places, specifically in Senegal. I alluded to it here, but I didn't have a chance to explain. But let me just say a couple of words about it. The major religious groups in Senegal, which are Sufi orders, Muslim Sufi orders. I won't explain what that is, but they're hierarchical organizations, under specific religious leaders, have historically, one in particular, very much engaged in agriculture. And one of the dynamics, and they have expanded under the leadership of leaders, huge areas of land for the cultivation of cash crops, peanuts in particular, cotton and some other things in some other places, but especially groundnuts historically. I think in the Amazon, you have soybean production, right? I mean, the use of huge crops of land.
Soybean and cattle ranching as well. Yeah.
Okay, so there's been huge, and this is very much. It's got a lot of these people have a lot of religious authority, and it's a very sensitive topic. But of course, this expansion of agricultural land comes at the expense of pastoral land and areas where animals previously were able to pass. And so we have very intense political debates. Senegal, I have to mention, I should have said it earlier, of the countries there in the region, Senegal's a democracy. Senegal's much more stable, and Senegal has much more functional institutions. And so in Senegal, there's occasional bits of violence, but it is not. It has been one of the cases where we see the capacity of state institutions much higher, and so they've managed to manage it. But it's exactly that. It's sort of the clearing of lands for agricultural use and the cutting of whatever. It's the Sahel, so they're not dense forests, but there are trees, etc., becomes an area of huge concern, and the potential for soil degradation over the longer run, etc., in the name of peanut production for religious authorities who are the ones who benefit. So that's there. But you also asked, I think, in terms of religion, the question of these jihadi groups or insurgent groups and their impact on environmental degradation. Honestly, I think it's a hugely important area. I don't have clear answers. As you can imagine, it's something that's extremely difficult to research because it's extremely difficult to operate in the areas where these insurgent groups, especially for outsiders, but even for my colleagues, of course, in the region, you can't very easily. I'll note that there's a project that I don't know them very well, but an American research project at the University of Maryland that was looking specifically at that in Mozambique. So it may be of interest to you in northern Mozambique. And I have to look it up and give their name, but they were looking at how insurgents were using natural resources to finance insurgencies in that area. I think I can say anecdotally two things: that there's a lot of variation in terms of the environmental impact of these groups in the areas. On the one hand, of course, sometimes groups are predatory and extract what resources they can in order to finance their activities, etc. And that certain, if they have an impact on population movements or on those kinds of things that have terrible repercussions. But there's also anecdotal evidence that given that part of the success of the jihadi groups in recent years in the Sahel is that they have managed to convince local populations that they can help more than the state can at times, specifically on managing things like the tensions between pastoralists and agriculturalists, and finding sort of ways of achieving sort of local justice systems, etc., that have some increased legitimacy. And so part of it, equitable distribution of water resources, etc., those kinds of things. In the cases where jihadi groups have managed to convince local populations that they are better at it than states, which have, as I said, frequently been, not always with variation, but predatory or difficult, they can have a positive effect on there. So I think it could be sort of quite interesting there. Health is a big area. I'll pause that. I hope you can have a chance to talk to some of my colleagues. Sarah McCune, in particular, is a public health specialist who would have an awful lot to say about that. Maybe we make that the subject of another one. Your question about local community responses. We spent a lot of time talking about this. I'll tell you a very summary. We find the local communities extremely responsive, extremely welcoming. I've had the pleasure of working in the Sahel as an outsider, as an American of Latin American origin, etc., in this region for over 40 years, and always extremely well received. That one of the pleasures of the Sahel is that populations are very, very welcoming in general. State authorities vary, right? If they see, depending on whether the state authorities see us as critics, etc. But local populations, the most difficult thing about working with local populations in the area, in this region of a lot of need and a lot of NGO operations, is that people are very happy to talk to us, almost always on the assumption that we're a project that's going to provide them something, that we're going to give them money or food, that there's going to be resources, that we're an NGO. They want to know, what are you bringing? And as researchers, we have to constantly explain that we're a research team trying to understand these dynamics so that we can help other people be more effective in the distribution of aid. But we don't distribute aid. And that's the most difficult part to challenge, is the expectations of populations that, they're very happy to see outsiders come in and hope that we're coming there to bring something. So that's a difficult thing. The community concept drawing, I'll invite you also eventually to speak to my colleague, Sarah McCune. I can tell you we have had a lot of discussions. She had piloted that in other areas and has tried to use it in the Sahel, has used it for our project in the Sahel, and had very interesting results. And she's actually, just a few days ago, we had a long conversation. She's rethinking it methodologically, how to best adapt it, because of the kinds, I found it quite effective in some ways. You're quite right that I think, Eduardo, you asked, and I hope you're hearing me, or you because it looks like you're frozen, but you're hearing me. Yeah, you're okay.
No, yes, I'm following you.
Okay, good. I think you asked whether this was also a form of intervention, right? Um, and I think one of the things we found is that, yes, she found that in communities where she does community concept drawing, subsequent interviews, for example, are affected by having done the community concept drawing because of the conversations it sparks and the discussions, and people attempt to, it creates new awarenesses. And having come back a month later, people say, we've been thinking about that. We're going to change what we're doing because of the CCD. So it's an interesting dynamic, whether it's best thought of as a research tool, like a survey, or whether it's thought of as an intervention strategy, attempting to actually get people to rethink behaviors and to modify behaviors. But that's something I think Sarah and her team are grappling with. She's one who really took the lead on that. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I was a bit long in my answers. But...
Muito obrigado. Muitíssimas gracias. No? Thanks very much. As you know, we've been doing that work with community leaders, right, in Manaus. Yeah. So that's why I see a lot of a great potential for collaboration here as well. Yeah. Thanks a lot. But I don't want to monopolize the 1,000 more questions that I have. Please, Professor Patricio Jeremias, Professor Mosquito Garrido, are you there? Mosquito, can you?
Yes, I'm right here. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Leonardo, to join us today. And I want to apologize because I just stuck in a meeting that's just finished a few minutes ago. Was with my boss, and I'm really sorry. But I did hear a little bit what you're saying, and I believe that's it was the same back on time when we have the civil war in Angola. When you see like people's coming from other countries, the first question that you looking for is like, what you bring for us? You bring food, you bring money. How can you help us?
Yeah.
So and I can see some similarity right here. But my question for you, Professor, is how you see the future of Sahel region in your research, in your opinion? What do you think is going to happen in the future for the Sahel region, for the Sahel people? What you see as a solution, as a, I want to just see your general opinion.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mosquito. I have to confess, obviously I could speak for hours and not give you a definitive answer, but try to speculate on the future. It's extremely hard to see, and I hope it maybe, if I think this was recorded, maybe I spoke a little bit about some specific domains. I have to say that, as I said earlier, I've worked in the region, worked meaning as an academic. I went to do a dissertation there. I've been there. I went there first more than 40 years ago. For many years, it was an underdeveloped but peaceful region where one could travel everywhere. The political violence in particular of the last decade or so has really complicated matters. And when you compound that, the political and security crisis with the climate crisis, with demographic pressures, with international changes, it's an extremely worrisome moment. What is sustainable for how long, I don't know. I have moments of being fairly pessimistic about the future of the region. And then when you're there, one of the things we see is that people manage to find innovative ways to survive. People manage to find innovative ways to adapt. Migration is one of them. But migration, of course, is something that the rest of the international community doesn't always embrace. And so we have this sort of context, I think, where the international environment does not facilitate local adaptation, sometimes has its own agenda. So it's very hard. I can't tell you. I think personally that I'm a political scientist by training, even though I have a very anthropological approach in some ways. I think I see the question of trying to rebuild kind of functional state institutions of some sort is absolutely central. A functional state that can deliver the differences we see between, say, Senegal and Chad, or Senegal and Burkina Faso right now, are extreme under fairly similar environmental and economic circumstances, but the difference is politics. The difference is capable states and that of course is predicated on human resources. So I think the Sahel's main resource, in my opinion, there's a lot of talk, there's gold or oil here or there. There's some minerals. Its main resources are human resources. It's got an extremely dynamic, very young population that is entrepreneurial, risk-taking, willing to work hard, etc. Unfortunately, the context for where you can take advantage of those human resources is very difficult. And if we think globally, there are parts of the world that are going to have exactly the opposite problem. A lot of old people and not enough young people working. And many of the young people in the Sahel are trying to go to those places, mainly in Western Europe. They're not welcome at the moment, but there's going to have to be change. I think in my international immigration is inevitable, and it's going to happen. Obviously, we're living it in the United States. There's a huge backlash in the North, in the global North, against migration and attempting to shut it down. And so it makes it extremely challenging for the region of the Sahel right now. So I don't know. We can go off on talking many different dimensions of the challenges, but I think the world would be wise to pay attention to the Sahelian situation because it requires attention, and especially the efforts to try to build functional state institutions, which are much easier said than done, obviously.
Thank you, Professor. So another question that I like, if you allowed me to ask you, is first I want to make this comment. We do have a huge community of those people in Angola, those brothers from Sahel, from Mali, Senegal, and Burkina Faso. They come frequently in Angola, look for a better life.
Yeah.
I could not agree with you that migration is going to be one of those solutions. But I want to bring now a specific country, Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has a new leader, as a captain, Ibrahim Traoré, that I can see a lot of ads around his image. It looks like as a little god in his country. How you see Burkina Faso in this new area right now, compared with what you studied a few years ago?
Yeah, thank you, Mosquito. Before I answer that about Burkina, let me just make a comment that I think is important what you said about migration. Indeed, Angola, Congo, Gabon, those areas have a lot of the Central Africa is one of the areas of Sahelian migration. And I think it's important to note that most migration from the Sahel is in Africa. It's not to transnational, it's not to Europe, despite the European anxieties. In Mauritania, there are whole populations. I have a PhD student from Mauritania. Many of his family are in Angola. They're shopkeepers, and they have a long history of multiple generations. And Brazil, for that matter, has a huge population of Senegalese in the last decade or so that is developing there. I'm sure some of you are aware with it. So, but especially, I mentioned, especially in Africa. And Mosquito, your question about Burkina Faso, it's a difficult one. And I will tell you that I may be wrong, but I'll tell you my impression. I think, and I want to sort of backtrack a little bit. Burkina Faso, as I'm sure you know, had a revolutionary history in the 80s. A very charismatic leader named Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated after a few years and replaced by Blaise Compaoré, his right-hand man, who was there for, I think it was 27 or 28 years. In a sort of a competitive authoritarian regime. He would hold elections, but very much in control, etc. But gradually developing some institutions. In 2014, when he tried to stay in power, there was a popular uprising. He was chased. And Burkina Faso made what I thought at the time, that was 10 years ago now, I thought Burkina is the hope of West Africa. It made a very good transition. There were good state institutions. The economics were reasonable, and made I think quite a reasonable transition. And so 10 years ago, I thought Burkina was the hope of the area. Unfortunately, they were both, I think we could analyze in depth. That regime itself proved to be a disappointment. There were some of the same people from previous regimes reconverted, and it had issues of corruption and others, but especially that the instability which started in Mali, right? Mali was where the jihadi issue started. Mali was the epicenter of it, started to spread regionally across the area, and Burkina was very much affected, and so it spread. And I think between the failures of that democratic regime of 2015, 16, 18, lasted until 2020, and with especially its failure and its incapacity to control this jihadi insurgency, meant it was sort of doomed it. And so there was a coup, and then another coup within a coup, and it's that second coup that brought the current president Ibrahima Traoré to power. I see. I've been in Burkina some since there. I was there after Traoré took office. People didn't expect him to last very long. He's a very young military officer. I believe he was 33 or 34 years old. And with very little background, I note now that there seems to be sort of he's played on this image of Sankara and the revolution. He wants to present himself as a sort of return of that kind of period, and he seems to have gotten a sort of a popular following. I personally don't see the basis for that. Burkina has become the epicenter of violence in the region, and especially violence against civilians. There's lots and lots of evidence that the state itself is targeting specifically the Fulani population of pastoralists, and there have been massacres that have been well documented by international NGOs and human rights organizations that I tend to think are credible. And the regime made what I think, starting with the civilian regime, I think personally, I think was a terrible mistake of trying to recruit civilian, they call them volunteers for the defense of the homeland, right? Volontaires pour la défense de la patrie, VDPs, arming local young men and groups supposed to be auxiliaries to the military. That's created the basis for private militias, for young armed groups that I think are not under anyone's control. And so my personal opinion is that my sense, and again, of course, it's highly debated, that Burkina, I think Burkina is at huge risk. My Burkinabe colleagues who are willing to speak, there's also been a very significant repression of opinions. Burkina a few years ago, up until 2 or 3 years ago, even under Blaise Compaoré and all of his years, had a very critical and open press, and a very critical and open, in fact, a very strong tradition of an open press, and a strong tradition of academic critics and intellectual speaking. Now people are afraid, people disappear. There's a repression there. Traoré seems to have managed. I don't know. I read that the social media, he's managed to really portray the sort of image of the revolutionary he's very much riding on the anti-French sentiment, which is very real, and there's a huge dissatisfaction with the French. He's managed to harness that and to use it for his own legitimation. He's pushing out the French. Obviously, he's aligned himself particularly with Russia and some other regimes, Iran recently, Turkey and others. And I think Russian, and so there's a war sort of on social media. I'm surprised to see this. It's sort of taken a bit seriously. I see no indication other than the anti-French rhetoric, which is understandable, I think. I mean, people are, of course, frustrated with the French made serious mistakes. They were welcomed, very welcome in 2012, only 13 years ago, very welcome, and for quite a few years. But now there were people waving French flags, and François Hollande, the president of France, arrived in Mali to a hero's welcome in 2013, so just a dozen years ago. But they made many mistakes. I think the French mishandled that, as I'm sure your military background, you're more aware than I am, but that presence in the Sahel was mishandled. So it's a long way to say that I am skeptical that this regime in Burkina Faso is providing an alternative, and every indication is that the violence is increasing, and the jihad. There's an expansion of violence under this regime, and unfortunately, every indication is that the regime itself or its people supporting it are partly responsible for that violence. Is my opinion. So. That may be controversial in some, but I think that's very much my impression.
Yeah. Thank you, Leonardo. this answer my question. Professor Patricio, Professor Eduardo, please.
Yeah, I want to ask Patricio if he wants to pose some questions related to the Mayombe Congo Basin. Patricio, please. No, we can't hear you. No, your microphone, Patricio.
It's mute. Está mudo. Yeah.
Now, it's okay?
Yes.
Thanks, Professor Leonardo. Thanks for the explanation. Like African, I is so very encouraged to hear. In Africa, the problems have been solved. So the problem is the how and when. But I saw some things here. You are very connected, very proper connection with the governance and these countries. So you are the you are the level to make one political or the view what the problems. How can to develop these problems? How can you solve these problems? But my problem is not with these countries of Sahel. It is the problem of the African south of Sahel. What do you want to make with a deep appeal to Africans, countries like Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, to make some things like to be prevented the ecological debate just was happening in Sahel?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a huge question, and I'm afraid I'm not really competent to answer it, partly because
okay, but
I don't know anybody has an answer, and because I don't know the region of the Central Africa particularly well. But I'll say, I don't think, I honestly, I tell people that I've studied the Sahel for a long time, and the more I learn, the less I understand. If you understand,
Okay.
you see what I mean. That is, I am confused. I don't. If someone had told me 15 years ago that the Sahel that I had known for 25 years would be in this situation of violence, political, I'd say, I don't think so. I mean, it didn't seem possible. So I don't know what happened. At the same time, I don't think it was inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable. I do think that it was that now as we look back, we sort of see, I think, in very general terms, in a place like Mali, because I think Mali is the epicenter. Mali is the core of it's the collapse of Mali in 2012, which really spread the instability across the region. And I look at the 30 years before that in Mali, right? In 20 years, so from the early 1990s, 1991, 92, Mali had a transition to democracy. And in many ways, people were very optimistic, but there was a lot of outside intervention, a lot of money to flow in to create the sort of trappings of a democracy that had very little substance, I think. Very little substance, and especially didn't work on reinforcing the state. We had a small group of people trained in France, trained, etc., who could speak about women's rights, about education, who could speak about the kinds of things that appealed, frankly, I think, to the West, and who were able to get resources from the West with that. But very little of it was invested in the infrastructure of creating functional state capacity, starting with the most basic things like education and health. 10 years after the democratic transition in Mali, I did a series of workshops in rural areas for teachers. And the conditions under which those teachers worked are just mind-boggling. There are hundreds of students in one room, one teacher, no books, no electricity, no water. At the same time that Mali was sort of a model democracy in the capital city, we had a lot of NGOs with four-wheel drive vehicles and whatever. And so I think the mistake in retrospect in Mali was that there was an enchantment with the sort of the symbolic trappings, a lot of priorities. Personally, my criticism of the West in particular, and the United States and France and other countries, was that the focus on democracy focused on things that were of interest to the West and not necessarily to Malians, and especially rural Malian Muslims. And I'll give you an example that I'm sure you resonate, the one most frequently. You know, the sort of focus that democracy had to include a section for gay rights. As a liberal Westerner, I support what I support. That's fine at home. But that's not a priority area in the rural Muslim Sahel. And to focus on that only makes democracy seem like a strange thing to rural populations. I can say the same, frankly, for things that I very much support, women's rights, but the sort of wanting to empower women, it's like, well, I think people were more interested first in sort of feeding their children, education, healthcare, the basic infrastructure. And so those are controversial things to criticize. I'm not suggesting that those aren't priorities and shouldn't be in some parts of the world. But I think that democracy was skewed, the democracy promotion was skewed towards the priority areas of the West and not towards the priority of Malians or Burkinabe. And so over the accumulation of years, there's an extraordinary dissatisfaction. And as a result, first, the state collapsed. And second of all, local populations didn't see any particular interest in rebuilding. What was the state? Alternatives became more attractive. And I think the jihadis have implanted themselves in part because the alternative state was not a particularly attractive option in terms of its capacity to distribute either basic primary healthcare, education, and justice, right? Justice, just conflict resolution at the local level.
Okay, thank you.
Very sweeping statement, and it probably rubs some of my colleagues the wrong way, but I believe that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, in the name here of the University of São Paulo, University Jean Piaget, Ombala do Saber, Amazonia Research Center, I truly want to show all our respect for your tremendous work, Professor Villalon. And if you just please give us a few days until we can organize all the ideas that are bubbling here in our mind, and then we'll definitely would love to continue that conversation and collaborate with you. Yeah, tremendous privilege that we do have to having you here in our climate network. Thanks a lot. A gente volta então no próximo segunda-feira com o Dr. Carlos Almeida e a doutora Abgessi Cora, né? Para seguir com os nossos debates. E eu acabei de deixar aqui todo o nosso respeito e imenso agradecimento, né, ao professor Leonardo Villalon, da Universidade da Flórida e líder do grupo de pesquisa sobre o Sahel africano, né? Muito obrigado a todos. Nosso infinito agradecimento, professor Leonardo.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Abraços.
Thank you very much.
Many more.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.